two reports to make to you this afternoon. And in the first report, which is DEQ's report to you on the additional public comments that we received in regard to sufficiency of nationwide permit 12, I have several parts of that report that will be delivered by staff. So I'm kind of the overview. So, Jamie, I don't know how to move it. I'd like to start out reminding you what your directive was at the April 21st, 2018 meeting. You directed that interested persons may submit crossing-specific technical information on three items: the sufficiency of nationwide permit 12 related to both Mountain Valley Pipeline and Atlantic Coast Pipeline; 2, the sufficiency of nationwide permit 12 and the general and regional conditions contained in it; and 3, the sufficiency of the Section 401 water quality certification that the board issued regarding nationwide permit 12 for specific stream crossings for both Mountain Valley Pipeline and Atlantic Coast Pipeline. You also directed that DEQ would evaluate the comments and submit a summary to the board. In your directive back in April, you also noted that no further action by the board is required, and that after review of the summary, the board may consider further actions consistent with its regulatory authority at its discretion without additional public comment on whether future action is warranted. So, general overview, the public comment period ran from April 30th, 2018 through June 15th of 2018, and it closed at midnight on the evening of June 15th. We received public comments via electronic mail, letters, and postcards. And we received comments on the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, slightly over 10,000 comments, 10,218. And on the Mountain Valley Pipeline, we received a little over 2,500, 2,543. The comments were made available to you, the board, and posted to our public website on July 25th of this year. So I'm going to spend a minute talking about some of the numbers in terms of the comments that we received on Atlantic Coast Pipeline. We received 2,079 comments indicating that nationwide permit 12 is inadequate for the activities involving stream and wetlands crossing. The most mentioned topics included impacts and concerns regarding trout, fish, mussels, and other aquatic species, concerns regarding water quality standards and potential impact to Tier 3 waters, water supply in terms of potential impacts, recreational use and business use of state waters, and other comments regarding erosion, sedimentation, landslides, slips, and steep slopes. We also received just over 8,000 comments, 8,069, noting that nationwide permit 12 is sufficient and is protective, and the most mentioned comments were that that nationwide permit 12 is protective, that there are operational safety and leak detection systems in place, comments on the impact on jobs and the economy, and then comments on the need for the pipeline. When it came to Mountain Valley, we received just over 2,500 comments that nationwide permit 12 was not adequate. And the topics most mentioned were very similar, if not identical, to what we heard on Atlantic Coast Pipeline, in that there were concerns regarding the impacts to trout, fish, mussels, and other aquatic species, water quality standards and potential impact to Tier 3 waters, potential impacts to water supply, recreational and business use of surface waters, and then again, concerns regarding erosion, sedimentation, landslides, slips, and steep slope construction. The most mentioned topic that was included in the comments that noted nationwide 12 is sufficient was that it is protective. So we took a look at the comments that were within the scope of the board directive, and that goes back to that initial slide I opened with in terms of they provided crossing-specific technical information. We received 32 comments regarding the Atlantic Coast Pipeline that fell into that, and we received 327 on Mountain Valley, but note that 304 of those were from one commenter, so it was a series of comments where it was kind of the same format, but the stream crossing identification and some of the information and calculations were different. The vast majority of these projects, of these comments that were within the scope of your directive in that they were crossing specific technical information focused on issues related to erosion and sedimentation control and potential sediment impacts to state waters and wetlands. For a number of the comments that were not within the scope of your directive, they were not targeted to specific technical information on specific crossings. Those comments were very similar to the comments that we all received back in December when we looked at the Upland 401 water quality certification. This is a list and summary. I'll run through them. Concerns about private property rights, eminent domain, negative impact to property values. The use of hydraulic fracking versus other energy generation sources, a preference for renewable energy, impacts to rural and forest viewsheds, that there is no demonstrated need for the project and no demonstrated demand for natural gas, the threat of explosions once in operation, increase in greenhouse gas emissions, permanent impacts to aquatic species and water quality, no consideration of cumulative impacts, increased economic development and job creation, safety of pipeline transportation versus other methods of transporting natural gas, and then comments on the thoroughness of both the evaluations conducted by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC. I have a couple examples and just was going to run through them quickly. A lot of the comments, the majority of the comments really were general information and not technical information related to a specific crossing. Just in a couple examples, open trenching will cause release of sediment to stream. Using open trench methods will not permanently impact streams. There were comments that we received about horizontal directional drilling in terms of lacking geotechnical studies that support the use of it, and that inadvertent return of water and or spoils management measures are inadequate. There were a number of questions about the federal, state, approval process and the host of roles and responsibilities regarding regulated project activities. For example, there were concerns about the definition of wetland, what's the delineation of wetlands, how wetland resources are co-regulated by the Corps and DEQ. There were comments that not all surface water crossings were identified. And then there were comments talking about minimum design criteria that we utilize in erosion and sediment control and stormwater controls, and basically the various roles of all those programs and how they interact. We had comments that talked about an expectation of no impact to the environment. For example, that sedimentation is a permanent impact, not temporary. Measures should prevent all releases of soil and material. They should withstand all weather events and completely avoid any ground disturbance in specific geographic areas. And then there were comments regarding aquatic species protection. No time of year restrictions were applied at certain crossings, and then comments on how other agencies play a role in considering the need of protecting aquatic species. There were some comments that expressed disagreement with federal and state law and regulations regarding the regulation of natural gas projects. For example, Nationwide Permit 12 does not adequately consider cumulative impacts, and that there are more impacts occurring than should be allowed by the single and complete crossing structure. And then there were topics that are not regulated either by Section 404 or the Virginia Water Protection Permitting Program, and those included comments regarding social justice and impacts on economically and disadvantaged communities, economic drivers, creation of jobs, and then legal issues, most often highlighted the validity of the exercise of eminent domain by the pipeline developers. So, general overview of the comments. We did provide you the Excel tables that identified the comments and summarized them. I know it was an awful lot of material, but we really wanted you to take a look at it and not edit it down for you. Right now, I am ready to tee up 3 different presentations by staff. The first thing we're going to run through is a comparison of the conditions and requirements of Nationwide Permit 12 as compared to what is authorized under Virginia's Virginia Water Protection Program regulation. In summary, and Dave Davis is going to come up here and we'll go through the requirements side by side, but in summary, of the 46 regional and general conditions in the Corps' Nationwide Permit 12, only 2 differ from our Virginia Water Protection Permit Program, and both the Atlantic Coast Pipeline and Mountain Valley Pipeline have offered to address those 2 provisions, and the Corps incorporated those 2 provisions as conditions to their coverage under Nationwide 12, and they're about mitigation. They're not about the nuts and bolts of actually doing the stream crossing. And for linear projects, we see an awful lot of road construction. And so for linear projects, whether it's a road, a pipeline, a natural gas pipeline, a sewer pipeline expansion, both DEQ and the Corps have substantially identical permitting requirements. I did want to make note of one provision that's in state law where there is no corollary at the federal level, and it is language in the State Water Control Board. I've provided you the citation 62.1-44.15:21.D.2. And I have summarized what that language says, but essentially the General Assembly has put in state law that no board action on an individual or general permit for facilities and activities of utilities and public service companies regulated by FERC shall alter the siting determination made through FERC approval. That goes to some of the issues of avoidance or possible avoidance and minimization, and that once the FERC alignment has been approved by FERC, we don't have the authority to make determinations that alter the siting. And the General Assembly put that in state code some time ago. So with that, I am going to ask Dave Davis to come up here and go through the side-by-side comparison of Nationwide 12 permit conditions and requirements in the Virginia Water Protection Permit Program.
Good afternoon, Mr. Dunn, members of the board, good to see you again. I'm going to take a minute and just do a side-by-side comparison for your information of the VWP permit requirements and the Nationwide 12 permit requirements. You'll see on the slides that there's a lot of words on some of them because I've provided direct quotations out of the regulations, but I've tried to highlight key words to focus your eye so that you can see that in many cases there's actually direct verbatim wording in both statutes. So the first thing is that both the VWP permit and the Corps Nationwide 12 Section 404 permits apply to the same activities, dredging or filling surface water and wetlands. And then linear transportation and linear utility projects have substantially identical permitting requirements. VWP regulations state that coverage under a general, regional, or nationwide permit promulgated by the Corps of Engineers and certified by the Water Control Board shall be deemed coverage under a VWP general permit regulation. And then you saw this on Melanie's presentation, but state law says that no board action can alter the siting determinations once FERC has made a determination on the location. This is just a summary slide to summarize the next, 25 or so slides. But this is to show you that both the federal and the state permit have requirements on how to delineate wetlands, avoidance and minimization, compensation, definition of single and complete project, and so forth. As we go through the side-by-side comparison, I'm not going to read the details of each slide for you, but again, you'll see the highlighting as I've tried to point out the similarities. So both programs use the same joint permit, the same forms, the same information submitted. Both programs have the same or substantially the same definition of what constitutes a single and complete project. Both programs have the same threshold for when compensation is required, over 1/10 of an acre of wetlands and or over 300 linear feet of stream. Both permits require compensation for permanent impacts. And there is one difference. One of the two differences here is that the VWP permit program does have a requirement for conversion impacts, conversion being currently forested wetlands that will be converted to emergent wetlands through a project. And as the asterisks show, both pipeline companies have voluntarily offered that. They would compensate for those conversion impacts, and the Corps of Engineers incorporated that in their nationwide 12. Both programs have requirements for erosion and ENS control. Both programs use the same technical criteria for identifying surface waters and streams. Those are programmatic similarities. Next, we're going to go line by line through the VWP regulation and compare that with the nationwide 12. The biggest chunk will be the standard project conditions, and then towards the end, there'll be some special conditions. So both programs discuss impacts to beneficial uses and the need to avoid and minimize those to the practical extent possible. They both talk about activities which cannot disrupt the movement of aquatic life or aquatic species. Both programs require that flows downstream be maintained to protect those aquatic species, and they both state that there should only be a minimal adverse effect on navigation. Both programs require that activities should not impede the passage of normal or expected high flows. And they also address continuous flows of perennial streams. Both programs state that excavation, dredging, and filling shall be accomplished in a manner that minimizes disturbance and turbidity of the water. Again, maintaining normal and low flows. And also, the construction activities are to minimize the construction materials from entering surface waters. Both programs require that all fill material be clean and free of contaminants, and have a requirement for the prevention and containment of spills of lubricants and other pollutants. Both programs require that any machinery or heavy equipment be placed on mats or geotechnical fabric, and that any restoration activities are conducted in the dry or during low flow periods or conditions. Both programs require that temporary disturbances are avoided and minimized to the extent practicable. And both require that all temporary disturbed wetlands are restored to pre-construction conditions within 30 days of completing work in that area. On the next slide. Yeah, this is the second of the two areas where there's a difference between the programs. This is a requirement that any wetland or surface water that is not proposed for impact by the project to be flagged in the field so that contractors can identify those areas and stay out of them. There's no companion requirement for that in the Nationwide 12, but the two pipeline companies voluntarily offered to do that, and that was accepted by the Corps and incorporated in the Nationwide 12 permit. The next couple of slides are special conditions. In many cases, they're a reiteration of the standard conditions, but these are special conditions for utility projects. And again, this says that any temporary disturbances or impacts shall be restored to pre-construction conditions. Any materials that are stockpiled, whether excavated or so forth, will be temporarily sidecast not to exceed 90 calendar days. Again, the language is similar in the Nationwide 12 program. As with the standard condition, there's a special condition requiring compensation for conversion impacts. And again, that's when there's currently a forested wetland that will be permanently converted to an emergent wetland. And as I said before, both pipeline companies have voluntarily offered that. The first one here that's dealing with pipes and culverts, it must be countersunk. That's pertaining to access roads for construction of the projects, and there's almost the same language across both programs. And then both programs require time of year restrictions as recommended by Game and Inland Fisheries. And then just in summary, of the 46 regional and general conditions of the Corps' Nationwide 12 program, only 2 of those differ from the VWP permit, and both of those 2 differing conditions have been voluntarily accepted by the 2 pipeline companies and incorporated in the Corps of Engineers Nationwide 12 permit for those. Again, as you see in the side-by-side comparison, both programs have similar or identical in some cases conditions. And that's across all linear projects, so not just natural gas pipelines, but any utility project and any road. Thank you.
We received that were crossing specific, crossed into issues of erosion and sedimentation control, and what kind of protections will there be for this construction activity. I think I had one more, so can you go back to mine for just a sec, please? I also wanted to mention that we have heard from a number of folks for a substantial period of time that one of the major flaws in utilizing Nationwide Permit 12 is that it is a blanket permit that does not provide any crossing-specific review or information. That is what happens when we look at our erosion and sediment control plans. So I have asked staff from our E&S and stormwater program, Jamie Robb is going to do the primary presentation, and then Ben Leach is here if we have questions or need to get into more details. Ben has been the point person for actually reviewing the E&S and stormwater plans for both of these projects. So I'm going to turn the podium over to Jamie, but I just wanted to point out a couple things. I've actually been in the field several times since construction has started, and one of the things that wasn't always clear to me in terms of some of these E&S controls and kind of the big picture is that we talk about E&S requirements for activity in wetlands and streams, but there's really two kinds of activity. There are instances where these streams and wetlands need to be crossed by trucks, by machinery, by the equipment that's actually involved in the construction of the project. And there's a set of requirements that sits out in our E&S, and Jamie will talk about this, that protects those resources from the trucks and equipment going across. There's a very prescribed way that you protect both those wetlands and streams. Then the second kind of activity is actually when pipe needs to be installed, either through the wetland or in the stream bed. So I kind of mix those two up in my mind, so sometimes when I was looking at the plans or hearing about things that didn't necessarily make all that much sense to me. So I just wanted to alert you that we're really talking about construction activity that crosses these resources and then pipe installation that occurs within those resources. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jamie.
My name is Jamie Robb, and I manage the Office of Stormwater Management for DEQ. Our office is responsible for erosion and sediment control review and stormwater management plans, not just for the pipeline, but for other projects that are regulated land disturbing projects across the Commonwealth. So I thought what Melanie's asked me to do today is put together a little bit of information regarding our erosion and sediment control review regarding specifically stream crossings, but I just want to, emphasize again, while this particular presentation is specific to the stream crossing portion, we are reviewing the E&S requirements for the entire project itself. So, get started. So under our erosion and sediment control plan review, every stream crossing is reviewed. Matter of fact, every portion of the land disturbing activity is reviewed. This includes the route that it's going through, the type of land cover that's being disturbed, ensuring that the proper controls are being put in place, looking at the erosion and sediment controls as a system-wide set of controls. So for example, what happens in the uplands, making sure those controls are adequate to protect the downstream portions of the project as well. Specifically, I think it's very important to note as well that here in Virginia, we don't require any work in the streams while they're wet. So that requires some level of that requires the companies to come up with some other alternative to make sure that they're working in the dry conditions, and we'll talk a little bit about that further. Specifically under the erosion and sediment control regulations, we have 19 standards that speak to both upland and stream crossing erosion and sediment control, and specifically there are 3 that address the stream crossings. And additionally, I'll talk briefly about the overlap with our erosion and sediment control program as well as the nationwide 12 program. So just getting started, I thought I'd highlight the 3 erosion and sediment control minimum standards related to stream crossings. And as you can see, we've got minimum standard 12 that states when work in a live water course is performed, precautions shall be taken to minimize encroachment, control sediment transport, and stabilize the work area to the greatest extent possible during construction. Non-erodible materials shall be used for the construction of causeways and cofferdams. Earth and fill may be used for these structures if armored in a non-erodible cover material. Then we've got minimum standard 13. When live water courses must be crossed by construction vehicles more than twice in a 6-month period, a temporary vehicular crossing shall be constructed of non-erodible materials. And then minimum standard 15, the beds and banks of water courses shall be stabilized immediately after work in the water course is completed. So as you just heard a presentation from Dave Davis that talked a little bit about or gave you a comparison of the VWP permit requirements and the nationwide 12 permit requirements. And as he mentioned, each stream crossing is considered single and complete for linear projects. The crossing of a single water body multiple times is considered separate. And so we're looking, when we're reviewing those erosion and sediment control plans, at each one of those crossings, evaluating those erosion controls specifically at that crossing. We want to make sure that stream and wetland impacts are minimized or avoided when possible, minimizing the amount of soil disturbance associated with the land disturbing activity, and then maintaining normal downstream flows. And all of that aligns very closely with those conditions of the nationwide 12 that you just heard about. So again, the nationwide 12 requires erosion and sediment controls to be maintained during construction. That's exactly what we're looking at. It requires excavated material be placed back into the trench to the original contour. So when we get these plan sheets in, we're looking at the pre-construction condition and the post-construction condition and ensuring that those contours, that the land cover, the contours, the stream banks, all of that is returned back for these particular projects. And in addition, as they do work in these streams, they're excavating those stream beds, they're segregating out the materials, the soil materials, and then replacing those back after they've finished their work in the same level of order that it was removed, that it's in the ground. And then, of course, stabilizing with river rocks or whatever natural stone was there to begin with. And then this helps protect that in-stream scour or sedimentation that could have occurred from that work in the stream. Additionally, we require the pre-construction elevations and revegetation of the site, and that plant species that are native to Virginia that are not invasive be used for vegetation purposes. So I mentioned earlier that here in Virginia, folks can't do work in the wet. They can only do work in dry streams. And that's unique to Virginia. Some of our neighboring states don't require that, as we understand it. So there's a variety of methods that they can use to do that work on stream crossings. And what we're gonna look at is just some very elementary diagrams that we've come up with on some of those crossings. Primarily, we're seeing dam and pump or pump around crossings. We've got flume crossings. At one point, there was consideration of a cofferdam, but I believe that that's been taken off the table. And then, of course, there is some consideration of HDD, horizontal directional drilling. So, again, excuse the very elementary photos, but what I wanted to do is we're going to have some photos of plans later on, but I wanted to show, without all of the other fluff that comes on plans that we look at, just the crossing itself. So you can see here that what we've got is a pump, dam and pump around, and the upstream side of the stream, it's dammed off. Then a pump is installed and piping such that stream water is then literally pumped around to the other side of another dam so that they can do the work in the dries required by Virginia. Another type of crossing is a flume crossing, and essentially very similar setup here, but instead of pumping around the site, a pipe is actually laid through the dry area of the crossing that allows the stream to continue flowing to just the other side of the dam. And it's important to recognize here we also require the energy dissipation mechanisms and measures to ensure once that water makes it to the other side of the dam that it's not creating an erosion or sedimentation problem as it's being released. We have a cofferdam diagram here. Just essentially, this is typically for your wider streams and crossings, and they do a little bit of work, dam off a certain area along the river, along the stream banks, and can do some work in the dry after they've pumped out that water, and then eventually make it across to the other side. And lastly, as I mentioned, horizontal directional drilling is a crossing method that is proposed as part of these projects. And essentially, they start on one side away from the stream banks. Usually, it's set back a little bit in the upland. And they drill a pilot hole in the direction that they want to drill and underneath the stream bed. And through time, they replace that equipment to drill out larger and larger diameters until they get to that size that they need for the pipe installation. Usually they start on both sides of the stream and then meet somewhere in the middle. So what we've got now is we're going to have a few pictures of the stream crossings, and I apologize, they're not very big, but we didn't want to lose some of the resolution here. But here we've got an example of a crossing in Augusta County, and just to note, these have not been approved yet. This is just for example purposes. And I'm going to ask Ben Leach, who's our lead technical reviewer on this project, to walk you through some of the erosion and sediment control measures that are being evaluated and looked at through our review. Specifically in the plans, hopefully we don't get too technical, but this is what we do when we look at.
Chairman Dunn, members of the board, my name is Ben Leach. I am the technical lead on these particular pipeline projects and overseeing the contract work by our third-party reviewers. Just to note that our stream crossings typically, almost all of them, are pump arounds approach. A flume could be potentially used if we see a significant rain event coming in, but most streams are being crossed in a manner of within 72 hours and then being restored to post-construction conditions and stabilized. So rarely will we see a flume being utilized for this particular project at this time, and for both, actually, more than likely. There are a handful, roughly about 7 HDDs that will be potentially used during this project. Not all of them are necessarily tied to stream crossings themselves. For example, the Blue Ridge Parkway for Atlantic Coast Pipeline going under the mountain for about a mile. And that is an example of HDD not being used for stream crossings. In this particular example, this is in Augusta County. The Middle River is part of the Shenandoah River Network. You can see that it is a cofferdam system, and this is typically what we see on detail, and I'll go into further detail and plan view further along in these slides. Jamie, next one. Another example that I will be going through is in Bath County. It demonstrates braided streams in which it shows how the E&S measures are reviewed, and at the scale that we review them at is roughly 1 inch equals 50 feet typically for a majority of our reviews. Stream crossings are called out in both projects at a resolution for which one can discern what the stream crossing techniques are, and I would like to note that in the Atlantic Coast Pipeline plans, their resolution was at a higher scale, so they were required to do far more stream crossing details for us to discern what was there. And that's why when you'll see one day the approved plans, that particular detail will have significant amount of stream crossings shown. It's further, right? Or no? Okay. Jamie's changed the slides on me. Sorry. Jamie highlighted one of the key issues here. Stream crossings themselves and the E&S measures work as a collective system. It is not one measure that holds back the erosion and sediment control, the sedimentation from leaving the site. It is a series of measures that are installed in a sequence that allow for maximum filtration that can occur and decrease of energy that will leave the site that could cause further damage downstream. Our key techniques for how we approach that is through utilization, first and foremost, of clean water diversions. Clean water diversions, which you can see on this particular image, are in that, God forbid I say it, North Carolina blue. And that particular element, along with the diversion dike, which is in magenta, guides the water, clean water, from off-site away from the site activity itself. Without these particular measures installed, the E&S measures within the confines of the limits of disturbance cannot be properly sized, technically engineered size, for that slope extent in the drainage area contributing to that. So these particular elements divert the water away from the construction site. So the only runoff that will occur as a result of potential sediment and latent runoff will be from the confines, any raindrops that fall within limits of disturbance, which is typically 125 feet wide. Another technique that we are using for this particular, both projects, are slope breakers, or also known as water bars. They break up the interval of water as they fall down the slope. They concentrate flow it into a sump and then into a triple stack compost filter sock or a belted silt retention fence, which allows for the dampening of the energy of the water before it leaves the site. Then these particular elements tie into the perimeter measures, which are usually compost filter socks and belted silt fences. We rarely, if ever, on both of these projects, see traditional silt fences, which everyone sees are the black silt fences on most construction sites. These particular measures that are utilized, super silt fence, which is literally a chain link silt fence with a belted silt fence attached to it, allows for these waters to pass through and not fail due to slope conditions and so forth. And let me highlight one thing. Our E&S measures in Virginia are sized for the 2-year, 24-hour storm event. That is what's outlined within the CGP through EPA, and that's a legacy that carried over into our E&S regs. And most of the rain events that we have seen to date are exceeding those 2-year, 24-hour storm events.
slope?
The steep slopes are another concern when we're approaching any form of wetlands, water bodies. In this particular case is a steep slope condition. It's coming off the mountainside or hill down into the flatness of the middle river and then enters the floodplain on the opposite side. Most slopes are in the western half of the state, you know, we're looking at between 30% and 50% slopes, and that's not degrees, that's percentages. So when these ENS measures are installed, we typically will go out and inspect them after they've been installed and after rain events, and then if need be, do adjustments in the field to make them more robust as the steep slopes may behave in a certain way due to certain soil types, and that's what we usually do. Go to the next one. Okay. So one thing that's unique to...
You're too low.
Please pull it down if I'm like to hear this discussion.
It's a presentation, you can't just lie.
One thing that's unique with these projects is the series amount of streams that they do cross, and we took that into consideration on how they approach the crossings. The timber bridges are typically what you see as a transport crossing type, and you see that at each of these particular crossings. They could use something called a Bailey's Bridge, which is a more robust spanning bridge. We have yet to see one of those installed to date, but it could be shown in future crossings. These particular pump arounds, this is another example of one. What we end up doing here is allowing for the pipe to pass through using trench breakers sometimes, trench plugs, sorry. Those trench plugs allow the water to pool behind the pipe, and then we bleed or drain them off periodically. So in case rain event, the key issue is you don't use the channel, the trench itself, as a conveyance system. We utilize it as we transport it off-site or to the edge of the right-of-way and dissipate the energy within that. This particular crossing is unique, along with, there's a couple others, where you'll cross one stream and then you'll have to cross another and then you'll have to cross another. And it's because majority of the time these, in this particular case, we're looking at the upland area of the mountains, and these streams are located typically at the headwaters, and you'll have intermittent streams and braiding of streams constantly coming into play during our review process. And that's a legend in case any of you want to review this at a later date. Keep in mind these are draft for Atlantic Coast Pipelines examples. The next is a actual stream crossing that occurred and is, as of yesterday, this is a photo of the Roanoke River, the North Fork of the Roanoke River. This is the channel. It has been restored to a post-construction condition. It will be monitored as it settles into the environment as the water flows. The slopes have been stabilized immediately with matting material, and the timber bridge, as you can see, is there to allow for crossing to continue. If you see on the upper half of the image, that is actually a super silt fence to add extra protection to that slope on this particular project, because there is a steep slope upstream of the North Fork of the Roanoke. Another thing I would like to note is 25 feet on all streams and water body crossings is a water bar to add an extra feature of protection. Both the water bar is placed temporarily for the full stretch of 125 feet for the post-construction. Sometimes it's in the neck down area, so it's 75 feet. And for post-construction, you're looking at a 50-foot water bar that's required as well to add that extra protection once the project is buttoned up and restored. Yeah. I did forget to mention, every stream crossing is required to follow a neck-down procedure. The neck-down procedure is based off of going from 125 feet. Sometimes you'll see an alternate work location or work site, which is a bump out, as we'll call it, and then it necks down to 75 feet. The 75 feet is determined by 50 feet off the center line of the water body crossing itself, and that's why sometimes you get abnormal neck-down shapes and sizes during this project. This is also another look closer up of the North Fork of the Roanoke River as of yesterday. The initial colloidal clays are layered back in. It's to allow for the rocks to adhere to the surface of the stream bed. Over time, and by time I mean a matter of weeks, this particular channel will show less and less colloidal clay on the surface within the bed of the channel.
But it's still there.
This is another stream crossing near Chaos Mountain. You can see in this particular picture, it's steep slopes on either side. The bumps that you see are actual water bars measures that are installed. The first one shoots to the right, the next one shoots to the left, and it goes back and forth sometimes, or it goes all to one direction. The blue and the green items that you see in these photos are compost filter socks. Those particular socks, 2 weeks ago when I was out there, are 24-inch in diameter. They're to allow for stabilization of the slope. The matting material is the tan color, and then you can see also the grass coming in as well. Currently, this particular stretch of the mountain is being restored to post-construction criteria, which will require returning it back to its original line and grade based off of the LiDAR topographic imagery that was created, and also restoring 75 feet of this right-of-way to brush scrub seed mixtures that have been vetted by DCR, along with a 50-foot center line where the permanent right-of-way is of pollinator species meadow seed mixes for this particular project. That's the bridge crossing as well. You'll see it right there. That is currently still there, but they will be removing that here probably in the next week or less. This is the actual stream itself. As you can tell, they stabilized the banks, met the original line and grade of the post-construction requirement. The stream is reflecting what the common characteristics of this particular stream are. The rocks are heavy, fragmented, cleaved off from rock faces many years, but this is how it will typically look on the streams once they restore it. And in some cases, you'll have streams require a live sapling or live stake of willows, depending on which agency put forth that requirement to restore the 25 feet or up to whatever area that's not part of the permanent right-of-way as a restored riparian area. To give you some framework of unique conditions at the pipeline, this is one of the active trenches that was there 2 weeks ago when I was visiting. This particular trench is at Bent Mountain near the Blue Ridge Parkway. As you can tell, there is water standing in the trenches. With pipe in it. Now, what I would like to highlight is you'll see periodically a small brown pipe that is there. There are 3 of them. Those are agriculture field drains utilized to drain the fields. That implies that the fields themselves have historic high groundwater tables, and this allows for the farmers to not create a muddy area for which their cattle work in. When the project is live, and they're actively doing work. They utilize that black material off to the left to pump the water out. It's one of their dewatering facilities for pump water. And it goes through a series of filtration devices that flows down into a swale that leads towards a native creek.
Ladies and gentlemen, staff doesn't interrupt you when you're speaking, so I would ask that you please not interrupt staff.
We can talk for half an hour?
I was interrupted earlier.
So I would like to highlight this particular one because it is a wetland on the left where you see the green. That was identified and flagged as a wetland. You see the bridge crossing said wetland, and there is also further down a cattle crossing area for which the owner can still access his lower fields with his cattle. At this time, the cows were not there during my visit. This is an example of a clean water diversion that allows for the water that's upslope. This particular area drains about 7.5, 6 acres, give or take, that feeds into this clean water diversion. The upper slope is a clean water diversion dike that sends the water to this particular feature and prevents it from entering the right-of-way where it can mix with soils that have been sediment-laden runoff. The area is isolated. It is surrounded by riprap to allow for energy dissipation to occur. And that should be it.
The discussion about the design storm being 2-year, 24-hour, how many times has that level of storm happened since the MVP started?
Can you answer that definitively?
I can't answer.
So there is, we collect and look at precipitation data, and a lot of times what we'll do is kind of go back and look after the fact to see what was that storm event, and if it created a certain problem. I know that the newspapers at least were replete with information that the 14 inches we got in July or June were just an extraordinary
Well,
amount of
that's
rainfall.
not 24 hours though. That was a month.
Right, that was over the course of the month.
Yeah, and I think one of the, obviously a lot of the pictures we've seen, et cetera, and this bears upon the Nationwide 12 because of, you know, the DEQ's role in the E&S part of the Nationwide 12, as part of the permit condition for the Nationwide 12 is compliance with DEQ's E&S. And I remember when we were dealing with the stormwater management for the VIPD's permit for the CAFOs, and that design was a 25-year, 24-hour storm that they had to design for. And when I looked it up under the, who the heck does that, NOAA or USGS, it actually statistically occurs once every 4 years. So even though it says 25-year, it really happens more often than that. And I was trying to understand with the stormwater, you know, for the erosion and sediment control, if you're doing a 2-year 24-hour storm, that would seem to happen more frequently, correct, than every 2 years. It might happen several times in 1 year statistically.
I'm not.
Well, that's why I said I had a technical question, and that I really wanted him to
That's fine.
answer. Okay, so is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
So the stormwater management, or the ENS program that you'd be using for this, for any nationwide 12 you would approve a plan that protected rainfall that protected the water quality for rainfall that was happening within a 2-year, 24-hour framework, but nothing greater than that.
So the 2-year, 24-hour storm event and the requirement that ENS measures be designed to meet that is an existing state regulation. That's what your reg says. Under ENS, that's what you design to. And, there certainly have been conversations that, given precipitation and climatic changes, that maybe that's a different maybe there should be a different standard, but at this moment in time, what your regulation says is you design to a 24-hour 2-year storm event. Now, one of the things that I've heard Ben mention, and he could probably provide more detail on this, is because, as he mentioned, these ENS controls are a system, a lot of the things that we have in place are actually probably capturing more like a 10-year event. Isn't that what you said? No. So, but the regulatory standard is 2-year, 24-hour event.
The revised standard, doing the job.
Hold on. Well, you can go on. Somebody else can go on. I've got so many questions.
First, I want to acknowledge that Chairman Dunn and I came up to DEQ last week and had about a 3-hour session with Ben and Jamie, Jim Golden, Melanie, to talk about the ESC review process and the details of the standards, and I found that to be very helpful. It was a more in-depth presentation than we've had an opportunity to do today. But I want to acknowledge that all of the board members have received a lot of input from concerned citizens, a lot of it accompanied by photographs of what appear to be failing control measures along the right-of-way. And I guess I'd like to know, just hold off, please. I'd like to know if you can, and I think I provided you with some of the photos that we've received, which I sent earlier to DEQ. I'd like to know if you can give us some information on the conditions at those sites today, and what, if any, follow-up action DEQ has taken to address those. And I mean, we received a lot of photographs. People are holding some of them up. We got them all. We saw them. I sent you just 3 or 4 of them, and I think they're loaded on the computer so that you can, so that you can look at them.
I'm certainly willing to do that now, but my second report to the board is about all the things you asked us to report to you on back in April, and I have a whole wealth of information in terms of complaint investigations, compliance inspections, statistics, notice of violation, and they are 2 separate reports, but I can certainly answer your question now if that's the will of the board.
I'm perfectly fine with doing that when you provide the other context for current conditions in response to concerns and complaints. So that's fine.
Anything else?
No, not for me.
And you might touch on this on your second presentation too, so if so, just tell me and that's fine. For me, as I've been reviewing everything, one of my big questions has been trying to understand what we're doing about in the field verification of or definition of a temporary versus a permanent impact. And then obviously if we feel they're permanent impacts, I guess the question is more about what's happening. Are we calling Army Corps to come out and verify, or doing any kind of collaboration between agencies in that regard to determine a path forward, if it's a notice of violation or enforcement action of some sort. So again, that might be.
That is addressed in the second one? Well, I do have a conclusion to the first report. Jamie?
You come.
And the conclusions that staff has drawn, and one, the majority of comments did not provide specific technical information on why Nationwide Permit 12 is not sufficiently protective at crossing specific locations. Secondly, that no new crossing-specific information supports the conclusion that Nationwide Permit 12 is not protective of any specific wetland and/or stream, and that the majority of comments reiterated the issues that were brought up in our discussions regarding the Upland 401 water quality certification process.
That was the time allotted to make comments.
Ready for the second presentation? Jamie? Thanks. Of items. You asked us to report back to you on guidance for stop work instructions, information on variances, both the process for evaluating and what variances have been approved. You asked us to discuss complaint response and coordination, and that's coordination with both the U.S. Army Corps and FERC, our communication and communication opportunities with citizens, our complaint procedures, and then in the parenthetical, I added myself, our inspection framework and data and information on inspection activities, because I thought that really meshed. So really there's, we spend time in the field both following up on complaint investigations and conducting our normal compliance inspections. So I've just merged those two together. The first thing I wanted to talk about are pipeline stop work instructions. Legislation was passed during the 2018 General Assembly session that added Code Section 62.14415:37.1 and 62.1-44.15:58.1 that created this authority for the Department of Environmental Quality to issue stop work instructions. There was an emergency enactment, which meant rather than waiting until a July 1st effective date, the legislation went into effect on the date it was signed by the governor, which was March 10th, and DEQ issued procedures for how we would engage in issuing stop work instructions by memo dated June 18th. There are 4 conditions in the statute that must be met before DEQ is authorized to issue a stop work instruction. First, it has to be construction related to a natural gas transmission pipeline where the interior diameter is greater than 36 inches, and both the Atlantic Coast Pipeline and the Mountain Valley Pipeline are greater than 36 inches. In fact, they're 42 inches. Pipeline construction activities need to be covered by approved annual standards and specifications. And as we have told you before, both of those pipeline developers do have approved annual standards and specifications. And then there has to be a substantial adverse impact to water quality or imminent and substantial adverse impact to water quality is likely to occur as a result of land disturbing activities. So in our June 18th guidance, we broke it into 2 parts. The first are considerations for stop work instruction, and then the second part is a bit more of the nuts and bolts and the details of the process for actually issuing a stop work instruction. In terms of what DEQ will consider in evaluating the appropriateness of a stop work instruction, it really is fact specific. And what the guidance tries to do is paint some broad categories that we will consider, but there is no magic one thing that may lead to it, and really the decision has to be made on a case-by-case basis. But in terms of what will we consider to meet the definition of a substantial adverse impact, the first is a discharge of sedimentation that results in significant damage to aquatic life or otherwise significantly degrades water quality. And then the companion to that are discharges containing pollutants such as fuel, chemicals, drilling mud, I'm sorry, there's a typo, or construction waste that result in significant damage to aquatic life or otherwise significantly degrade water quality. So that's that first bullet, which is when there's a substantial adverse impact. The considerations of when we may see a situation that is appearing to provide imminent, to demonstrate that an imminent and substantial adverse impact is likely. We have listed 5 things that we'll look at, and again, case by case, it's fact specific. This just gives us some direction as to the kinds of things that will alert us to whether we should consider the use of a stop work instruction. The first is a failure to construct and maintain erosion and sediment control or pollution prevention measures according to approved plans. The second is that erosion and sediment controls are not functioning and corrective action has not been proposed. A third is a failure to conduct timely self-inspections, and that self-inspection requirement applies to the holders of annual standards and specifications. Another thing we would look to is failure to timely provide and or maintain temporary or permanent stabilization, and those are requirements of our erosion and sediment control law. And then finally, if there's a failure to implement requested corrective action within the deadlines either spelled out in the E&S regulations, or if our inspection folks have given them an alternative deadline. So that's it for the considerations. So then you move on to process. And what we have said is that our stop work instruction has to identify 4 things: the land disturbing activities that must stop, the geographical scope of the project that must stop, the nature of the substantial adverse impact of water quality that was observed, or we have to explain the imminent or substantial impact that is likely to occur. And then finally, DEQ must provide corrective actions that we need to see completed and completed to approval by DEQ standards before the instruction can be listed. The last slide is a little about governmental administrative process, but upon the issuance of a stop work instruction, the company may request a review of that by DEQ, the director or his designee, and that review has to happen within 48 hours of issuance of the instruction. Then within 10 days of the issuance of the instruction, DEQ must provide an opportunity for an informal fact-finding, and that's language in the Administrative Process Act, which lets somebody come in and ask for a review of the instruction. That IFF covers both the instruction and if there was intermediate review by the director. And then finally, within 10 days of that informal fact-finding, DEQ must issue a case decision that either affirms, modifies, amends, or cancels the instruction. So that is our guidance for stop work instructions. The next thing you asked us to discuss were erosion and sediment control variances, both the requirements and the requests that we have received or have granted. The erosion and sediment control program regulation, as Jamie has mentioned, include 19 minimum standards that must be applied and must be addressed in the plans that are submitted to DEQ. So when Ben talked about all these sheets and sheets of plans, those plans demonstrate compliance with the minimum standards. There is a provision in your regulation that allows for variances from minimum standards to be granted that waive or modify any of the requirements that are deemed inappropriate or too restrictive for site conditions. And variances may be granted at the time of plan submittal or during construction if conditions have been uncovered during construction that would merit a request for a variance. So variance requests have to be in writing. They have to describe the nature of the request, an explanation of the design items for which a variance or exception is being requested. They have to provide the reasoning and or evidence that the variation meets the regulatory requirements, and they also have to provide us documentation to support the request. The language of the regulation tells Virginia Erosion and Sediment Control Program authorities, in this case DEQ is that authority since this project is being constructed under annual standards and specifications. But the regulation directs us to consider requests judiciously and to think about the need of the applicant to maximize cost effectiveness and the need to protect on-site properties and resources for damage. And then finally, any variance that's been approved has to be documented on the erosion and sediment control plan. So where are we in terms of variance requests with both of these pipeline projects? Both Atlantic Coast and Mountain Valley have requested a variance from minimum standard 16 of the erosion and sediment control regulation. That's the only variance that either developer has submitted. MS 16 limits the amount of open trench for installation of utility lines to 500 linear feet at any one time. So the minimum standard 16 says you can't have open trench for more than 500 feet, but you can request a variance. Historically, variances from this requirement for major oil and gas pipeline projects have been approved, and that has to do with the nature of the construction activity. So, what did DEQ look like? Look at and consider in these the variance request. And let me just say, because Atlantic Coast Pipeline does not have approved E&S and stormwater plans yet, there has not been a variance granted. That process of review and approval is still underway. For Mountain Valley Pipeline, we have granted the variance. So what did we look at in evaluating that variance request? We looked at the length of the project. We looked at the diameter of the pipe involved, the equipment required, the construction techniques that are utilized in the field, and we also looked at ensuring safe working conditions for the construction crews. We specifically considered a number of the construction techniques that are
water compliance. I'm just taking them through.
Just go, take them through, please.
Okay. This is one location at Grassy Hill. You have the compost filter socks in place. I believe this is the that's the prepared area below where there was a clean water diversion that had not been put in place. This area had received a lot of water. The initial control was a P1, which is the white grayish colored silk fence that you see there. It was modified since that time to have fabric put down the embankment, riprap put in, additional compost filter socks put in along that location to hold back and filter water before releasing it into the stream.
Sorry, technical difficulties here.
This time.
Right, and I believe that is believe that may be the location on the other side of the road from there, or it's further down Grassy Hill Road, but at the end of that work area where there is, again, they've added additional compost filter sock, straw bales, and silk fence. So that was another area where water was going, where additional flow needed to be diverted from those areas.
So corrective actions were taken in those locations, and do these pictures show corrective actions?
That's May 26th, the first one you showed was August 3rd.
Yeah, your pictures go out of order.
When were the corrective actions taken? You lifted the stop work order, what was it, July 20th? Some of those photos were taken after you lifted the stop work order.
He does it now.
That photo right there, that is the corrective action.
Still not working. Still not working.
Good job.
Ladies and gentlemen, please refrain from any outbursts. We were not able to hear the response from staff.
They said it was the correction. Seems staff is sitting right here.
Ma'am, if you please. Go ahead.
The actions that they did in the field at the time were to install the clean water diversion area, which is not pictured in any of these photos, and this work that was done here at the bottom when you see, what is it, August 3rd.
I don't know if this was submitted to us as a citizen complaint, this August 3rd picture. If it was a sign of investigation. We have not, as I mentioned before, it's not immediacy. We have to figure out, we have to schedule it, sometimes we have to get access if there are sites where there has been a potential impact off the right-of-way. We have to get access to that property, especially the condemnation sites. We have to work through a process because the construction activity is limited and access is limited to the defined right-of-way. I think there is a sense that when we see something, we should be able to mobilize that day and go out and look at it, and that's not always the case, and even if it is, we still have to come back and understand what happened. We have to look at plans, we have to look at field notes, we have to figure out what caused the situation. And it's not the immediacy that some folks would like it to be.
Mr. Chairman, can I jump in and just ask a question? I think just because of the scale of this project, it would be helpful to understand how many miles of pipeline are actually being worked on at once. Is there just sort of a logistic? I'm trying to understand the logistics. Is that, because you have 3 people? We have 3 staff, is that right?
We have 2 pipeline compliance coordinators, and Matt Park, he really has another job, but he's kind of been pulled into helping us on this. And then we have our third-party contractors, which we, through our contract, require them to have 1 person on site on each spread for all hours of construction activity. So that's, there are 3 spreads, and the spreads range from 30 to 40 miles. Jerome?
But they're not all active at the same time. I mean, there's not 30 to 40 miles being worked on at once, right?
The construction occurs in what I've been explained to as a train. So each spread is probably in a different state of construction. In some, it could be just that the trees have been felled. In some, it could be that the trees have been stumped and grubbed and the topsoil's been removed. In some, you could actually have a trench. In fact, there are about 20 miles, and they were in some of the pictures that Ben showed you, where pipe is in the ground, the trench has been closed, and the site is moving towards permanent stabilization. They've returned it to grade, or they are returning it to grade. So 20% is pretty much done. The other 80% is in different stages of construction activity, because the crews move through sequentially.
Okay, so with you have this slide about the complaints and the field inspections?
Yes.
Are the field inspections something that you do just independently, not in response to a complaint?
Yes, thank you. And I can go back to my report, and what I try, and that was the part that I added, which is there's one set of investigations that's complaint driven, and then we have our normal course of what do we look at, and what do the regulations say we're supposed to look at. So the next slide here is how we investigate a complaint. As I mentioned, we log the complaint within 48 hours, and then we go out and look and determine whether or not approved controls were installed and maintained. If approved controls are in place, we assess any impacts, if there were any, and we look at corrective action log or punch list to see what kind of changes or adjustments may have been in the field. If we determine corrective action was taken, we look to see whether they freeze within the 24 hours that the reg allows, or if there was an extension granted and approved. And then we follow up to make sure that whatever corrective action needed to be done was in fact taken. Now, for the non-complaint activity, we actually have 3 other types of compliance monitoring, and that is a focused field inspection, a comprehensive field inspection, and a stormwater pollution prevention plan, or SWIP inspection. And then, as I mentioned, the complaint investigations. A SWIP inspection I think of as more the administrative paperwork, where we're going to go to the construction trailers. There's one for every site, every spread rather. And that's where, as holders of annual standards and specs, and I'm just speaking about Mountain Valley now simply because that's the one that's under construction. So Mountain Valley has to keep their SWIP updated. They have to make notations. They have to document that they are performing E&S inspections once every 4 days, which is a requirement. So that's kind of an administrative review, is all the paperwork. Then a focus field inspection is when we may have been out and seen something, and we want to go make sure a corrective action is taken, or we have discovered a challenge, say with a water bar design that's already been approved, and we know, well, they were using that same design in this area that's similar, so let's go out and make sure that they really did what needed to be done to make it effective. And then the comprehensive field inspections, they're a little challenging on a long linear project, because typically you would go to a residential development and you'd be able to visit the whole site, you'd look at all the controls, but these are more sort of soup to nuts, is everything that's in the plan installed where it's supposed to be. So those are the different kinds of inspections we do.
Mr. Chairman. Then can you also remind us what their self-inspection frequency is?
Yes, that's the once every 4 days.
And within 24 hours of a rain event?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Yes, within 24 hours of a rain event. Thank you.
And are they adhering to that?
There were some of the violations that are noted in that NOV indicated that no, they had not been adhering to that. But we are looking. Yes, I'm sorry. Jerome Brooks, who runs our Office of Water Compliance.
Chairman Dunn and members of the board. One point I wanted to make for Roberta, I think she was asking, you guys may be interested in how many staff are associated with this project right now? You asked that question at the board meeting in April. We have 13. We have 3 staff members here working on the project. We have 2 dedicated, 1 part-time. We also have an administrative assistant that handles all of the complaints that come in, coordinate that complaint and log it. We have 11 contractors assigned to this project right now. They rotate out, 2 per spreader, 1 inspection, 1 complaint investigation. And we have 1 staff person we intend to hire in the next few weeks to assist us in the rental gardens. So that'll be 14 altogether.
I think we've covered everything that's in there. The last thing I wanted to report to you on again, and this was not in the assignment of the directive from April, but I thought it was worth reporting back to you on the status of the Upland 401 water quality certification that was issued by Virginia in December of 2017. A petition for review of that certification was filed with the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, and on August 1st, the court published its opinion regarding that petition for review, and the court concluded that Virginia's issuance of the 401 water quality certification was not arbitrary and capricious, and the petition for review is denied. I have just a couple summary comments in terms of what the court found. And the court found that DEQ had a sufficient basis to find reasonable assurance that the measures, restrictions, and programs in place in Virginia to prevent excess sediment from entering state waters satisfied our anti-degradation policy. The court reviewed and considered the use of annual standards and specifications, state erosion and sediment control requirements, findings of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency relative to the construction annual permit, and the court found there was nothing unreasonable in DEQ's interpretation of its anti-degradation policy. And I provided a quote from the court right there, simply because I think it goes to the guts of some of the things we're talking about. And the court said, certainly it must be anticipated with large construction projects that unanticipated problems will arise, leading at least to minor short-term issues. Where Virginia's policy interpreted as rigidly as petitioners suggest, no project affecting Tier 2 waters could ever be approved without an economic/social development analysis. My personal favorite quote from the court's opinion is the next one, that although Virginia's approach was unorthodox, it was not arbitrary and capricious for Virginia to analyze the impacts from activities covered by Nationwide Permit 12 from upland activities related to construction. And finally, the court concluded that together the conditions in the Upland 401 certification, the requirements of Virginia Wetland Protection Program, the Corps' 404 permit, the approval of annual standards and specifications all together provide reasonable assurance that water quality standards will be violated. So that's the end of my 2 reports.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
And I think this is sort of trying to distill the issues, and there's a little bit of overlap in between the 2 discussions. The Nationwide 12, really, I guess what as far as I understand, to do any site-specific repeal of the water quality certification would require an entire permit process to take back what we already issued. So that would be a process to repeal something and then another process to go through individual permits for stream crossings. So is that right?
Yes.
So it wouldn't be...
It sounds like what you're contemplating is issuing an individual permit for some or all of the crossings of either pipeline. And it's my view that under your regulations, the pipeline companies currently have permit coverage due to the fact that the board or DEQ has approved the Corps' Nationwide 12 permit, and the Corps has since then verified coverage under that permit. So your regulations identify the only mechanisms. So in order to issue an individual permit, you have to first modify or revoke the existing permit coverage. And your regulations identify the only mechanisms for doing that.
And as I understand things, there's not a lot of, the only difference for all practical purposes between the Nationwide 12 and the VWP is really process, just related to the Nationwide 12 is a general permit, so it's automatic as long as they comply with the conditions. And the VWP would be a permit process where it would be put out for notice.
Potentially, we actually have the board has adopted by regulation a general permit under the VWP program for utility crossings. So we actually have a parallel general permit.
So generally, I guess generally in linear projects, do you use that or do you use the Nationwide 12? Do you use the state or?
We generally use the Nationwide 12, but there might be instances where there is a utility crossing of a water feature that's regulated under the Virginia Wetlands Program and is not under the jurisdiction of the Corps.
Okay.
So that's when we might use that individual. I mean, the VWP general permit.
And so the Army Corps of Engineers, as I understand it, has a lot of experience with Nationwide 12, with district crossings. And a lot of the issues that people have raised are really going to things that have occurred since our April meeting, which have been a lot of discharges from sites that are undergoing work right now, that are already being inspected by DEQ. And so there were 40 inspections and 21 of them noted areas for corrective action. So that's like more than 50% of the sites are not even complying with the plans that are approved?
No, because the regulations allow for corrective actions to happen within the 24 hours. So in other words, there's not some of those absolute demarcations that folks are hoping there were. We design a plan, we go in the field, it gets implemented. When you talk about the kinds of things that we see in the field, it might be that a water bar was installed, but it wasn't installed exactly where or exactly how it was defined in the plan. So our inspectors will say, hey, you put in a water bar, but that's not correct. You have 24 hours to fix it. So that's what we mean when we say we note corrective actions are required.
I have a motion, but I understand that we're going to be hearing comment from the public.
Right.
And
Before we get to more
I'd like to
questions.
have my motion heard. It's 10 minutes, roughly 10 minutes to 3 right now. I'd like to have the floor at 3:27. Motion be considered.
Okay. We have just heard from DEQ doing the work that we requested on getting input from the public. And we got an awful lot of input from the public. We have a lot of people here today that would like to speak. Requirements are not necessary for public input for their report. However, I am going to open up the public forum for 30 minutes for public input, and then we will continue our meeting.
Could we have some, I have some additional questions of Ms. Davenport and staff. Can we ask some additional questions? Going back to, well, I guess two things. First of all, to Mr. Davis's presentation. I was under the mistaken impression, the hope that were we to wrest authority from Nationwide 12 and establish
then established that VWP permits would be issued, a VWP permit or permits in the case of possibly more than one general permit. But my expectation was that if we did that, we would have the ability to make some avoidance decisions that, as it's been explained, aren't really available to us because of the limitation that the General Assembly has established, that we don't have the ability to make a change in the right-of-way of a linear project. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So my initial hope and belief that we might be able to accomplish some additional protections by using Virginia's authority rather than the Clean Water Act authority appears to be a nullity. My question, my additional question, if I may, going back to the imminent and substantial adverse effect impact likely slide that you did, which I think was page 6 of the presentation. The second bullet is erosion and sediment controls are not functioning and corrective action has not been proposed. And I guess I was curious about the meaning of not functioning. And does not functioning mean that the required control measures were installed, but they've been overwhelmed by a storm greater than the one that was the basis on which the requirement was established? In other words, it was sized for a 2-day storm, and you got a 10-day storm. You got a flow from a significantly larger storm. It is not functioning. Is that covered by erosion and sediment controls are not functioning?
I actually think there's a couple different scenarios that could meet that definition. Part of it is that a feature was installed per plan, but sediment is still escaping the construction right-of-way. So that means you have to go back and rethink it and redesign it and correct it. With the issue of the storm events that exceed the design capacity, if it gets washed out, it's not functioning, but then you still have that requirement to come in and put it back to what it was designed in the plan and what it's supposed to do to achieve the controls. So it's really those two different paths.
But in that second case, if you lost the measure because it was blown out by the storm, would DEQ be satisfied with the regulations requiring nothing more than you put back what was there and it was established to be inadequate?
Yes, because that's what the minimum standards say, yes. I mean, we might also say, looks like you could consider putting some additional protections here, which would consider adding, stacking BMPs, and we might get to the result from that way, yes.
And I promise this is the last question. I think it was indicated that the storm event criterion for the measures was established in a general permit requirement that preceded our consideration of these projects. Is that right? It was imported from, did you say it was imported from the construction general permit?
The origins of this particular requirement within the E&S regulations and statute originate from EPA and the construction general permit. It is a practice that's standardly done throughout the United States, and that is how they size the storm events for erosion and sediment control during active construction.
But it's not working.
And
One more clarification. Yes. So, as you were walking us through VWP and the similarities between that and Nationwide 12, some of the statements were not allowing or impeding passage of normal high flows, substantial turbidity not authorized, water quality standards shall not be violated. And so in the situation that Bob was referring to a moment ago, the practice is blown out due to the intensity of the storm. Is the interpretation then that there's no need for any enforcement or mitigation or action related to that impact to water quality because of the intensity of the storm?
We actually, in some situations, move from what is appropriate and authorized under E&S to what is considered a violation of the VWP program. So in other words, if we see significant sedimentation in wetlands and streams off-site, and the NOV actually cites a number of instances where those are out, we've moved out from E&S and said those are violations of the VWP program because you did not have a permit to take that impact. And the result is that that sedimentation, that buildup, that has to be removed.
Okay.
I'm sorry, that just, this is, James, Mr. Golden and I spoke yesterday, and I was struggling with this issue that he discussed with me about turbidity not being a water quality standard, that you don't look at. The question revolved around all these pictures that we see. There's websites and emails, and we've all seen them. There's so many more than we've seen today, but that some of these are not violations. That so what I couldn't understand why if there's stormwater moving off the site that is causing turbidity, where you can see sediment in the water. You don't see it deposited yet, but you see muddy water. Why that wouldn't be a violation? But if I can understand it correctly, the violations come under VWP, and that's only for sedimentation?
When I talk about a violation under the Virginia Water Protection Permit, it is a filling of surface water, which means streams and wetlands, without a permit. So if that sedimentation caused a filling of a wetland or a stream, we would say that was an unauthorized fill. You did not have a permit to do that. If we see sedimentation and turbidity in the water column, we do not have an in-stream water quality criterion for sediment. And I don't know how you would even calculate. It's not like there's a point source and you can grab a sample of what's coming out of that effluent pipe and analyze it and do the analysis. If you've got turbidity that's moving downstream, it's not settling out, it is a temporary event.
Can I see if I can help Roberta a little bit? I think what Melanie said is, if you've got the turbidity, it's moved out of the construction site, it's in the stream. The turbidity is evidence of a discharge that was not authorized, and that's a violation of the law and regulations. It's not the same. I don't need any reinforcement. I've got a place to go. I'm not quite there yet. It's not necessarily a violation of a water quality standard. The water quality standard isn't there to be violated, but it is a violation to do a discharge without a permit.
Yes, but the challenge is there is no permit required for this construction activity. It is exempt from Clean Water Act 402 permitting. It's exempt from meeting coverage under the construction general permit. And even when you look at the requirements of the construction general permit, there isn't an in-stream end-of-pipe number. It's about employing practices, and it's about employing inspections, and it's about being responsive to what you see on that site to keep as much sediment on the site as possible. It's different from a traditional discharge permit.
You don't care.
Cindy calls your name, please come